Author and CBS News contributor Ibram X. Kendi is expanding on the lessons of his best-selling book, How to Be an Antiracist, in a new podcast. The weekly series, Be Antiracist with Ibram X. Kendi, premieres today. He will interview guests like former Cabinet Secretary Julian Castro, TV personality Don Lemon, and author Heather McGhee. The conversations will focus on how to build a just and equitable world. In the first episode, Kendi and disability rights activist Rebecca Cokley explore how racism and prejudice against disabled people are intertwined. Take a listen.
Just as the notion of a colorblind society is bullshit, so is the idea where people say, see the person, not the disability. No, I need you to see my disability, and I need you to see it as a fundamental part of who I am.
And for able-bodied people to no longer imagine themselves as normal.
Yeah.
Just as white folks should not imagine themselves as normal, and men should not imagine themselves as normal.
Definitely.
Ibram X. Kendi joins us now. Ibram, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for having me.
At the beginning of that conversation you have with Rebecca Cokley, you ask about the terminology we should use when discussing disabilities. And you say that we should learn to humbly approach conversations. Explain what you mean.
Well, I think what I've learned over the years, talking to people from different communities, I've learned that people in different communities have their own languages, have their own terms, have their own ways of understanding and seeing the world and identifying themselves. And in order for us to make bridges and cross bridges to different peoples, we have to understand where people are coming from, and we have to speak their language.
Yeah. And part of the reason for launching this podcast, you say, is that the topic of race and racism is much broader than many people think it is.
It is, and I'm someone who is a student and a scholar of racism, but I'm always learning because there's so many different forms of racism, from racism in housing to the environment, from racism affecting Native people, from racism affecting Black women. And so that's what I wanted to really do, is speak to experts to really learn and join with other people as they're learning too.
I learned a lot listening to your podcast, Ibram. I have to say, I never thought about racism and ableism. You know, you tell a very pointed story about your brother, who you said has some mental health issues, that the police were called to your house, and how fraught you were with fear about what could happen. Could you talk about why you were so concerned?
I think like many people all over this country who have a loved one who's a person with a disability, when I got a call that my brother was in a crisis and he had called the police, all I could think of was fear, and all I could think of was try to get over to my parents' house as fast as possible, because I know, unfortunately, police officers are not trained to respond to a mental health crisis. And so I didn't want anything to happen to my brother like has happened to so many people with disabilities all over this country.
Ibram, on the subject of learning, there's a push in schools across the country from Republicans in particular to emphasize the more patriotic, in their view, elements of our history, as opposed to some of the darker chapters, and in particular, not teaching the idea of systemic racism. As a college professor yourself, as someone in the education business, what's your response to that?
I think I am sympathetic to teachers and educators everywhere who are committed to doing our jobs. And our job is to tell the truth. Our job is to tell the good and the bad. Our job is to tell the light and the darkness. And I think that's what students want. And I know I've had so many students who've come to my classrooms in colleges angry that they did not learn about systemic racism and even about slavery during their K through 12 years.
You know, you say at your podcast at one point, racism is harmful to white people. I think white people and some blacks are going, huh? What you talking about, Willis? Yeah. So I wonder if you could just briefly explain what you mean by that, because you said when racism wins, we all lose.
Well, let's just take a current example. We of course, have talked about the way in which voter suppression policies are disproportionately disenfranchising, Black, brown, and indigenous people. Mm-hmm. But it's also disenfranchising and making it harder for white people to vote. It's making it harder for all of us to vote, in these states.
Well, you give people a lot to think about, Ibram Kendi, so bravo to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Ahead.
Of course, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.